Everyone. My name is Cameron, a former partner at BDO, and I'm here today with James Walder to talk about the BDO Social Housing Barometer, some of the key trends that have come out of the Social Housing Barometer for 2021. But to sort of, probably a good place to start actually is get James to introduce himself and describe what you do, James.
Hi, Hamid. My name's James Walder. I'm Executive Director of Finance and Business Support at North Star. I joined North Star just under 3 years ago. So my role covers finance, ICT, data digital, all the good stuff. And I've previously worked a bit in construction and social housing, so 8 years at home before that. So it's good to get back in the sector. North Star is a provider in the northeast of England, Teesside way, just under 4,000 units, a mixture of rural and urban stock. And been around for about 45 years now, so well established in that part of the world.
Great, thanks, James. So the purpose of today really is to sort of have a bit of a discussion, as I'm sure many of you watching are aware, BDO produce a social housing barometer each year, which is primarily focusing in what our clients see as the key risks. So effectively it's a survey which is sent out to our clients about what they see as some of those key risks. And it's quite interesting for us to look at the results behind that, because we see trends developing and new factors coming in. And this year it's been interesting to look at some of those factors that are things that we've seen before around financial pressures are still there, and the regulatory piece in terms of ensuring regulatory compliance, but also some new trends around ESG in particular, particularly the environmental aspect, but actually across the whole piece of ESG, and also from a people perspective, seeing more discussion around things like diversity and well-being as well. But James, from your perspective, in terms of some of these wider trends, what do you see as some of the key issues facing your organisation moving forward, and I suppose particularly from the perspective of where you're based as well?
I think the biggest challenge probably for the sector and for ourselves, decarbonisation, working out what it means, working out the pace to go at, trying to work with customers on what it might mean for them. We're just at the start of that journey for lots of organisations, so trying to understand some of the data on it, so you understand the condition of your properties, what rating your properties are, what you can do to try and improve those. And then obviously from a finance perspective, working out how you fund it. There's some huge numbers around, lots of reports out over the last sort of year, numbers running into the high billions, and everyone will be working on their own plans, and that's sort of adding into fairly full business plans already around health and safety compliance, pressure from the post-pandemic around rent collection, all those sort of issues, and actually trying to work out how you fund that is becoming really important. So that work's really started, and it's probably 12 months ago. We're really trying to get to grips with the data and understand that, and then look at how we model that in our business plan and address that. As well, and it sort of feeds into the ESG agenda as well. So again, that's the E part of that's becoming increasingly important. I think most organisations in the sector are pretty well established on the S part, the social value element, and there's pretty tried and trusted methodologies to present that. And then the governance part, again, the regulators with the governance and viability ratings takes care of that in some regards. So it's really focusing on that E part and how you sort of get started on that and what it might mean, because it's a real long-term plan as well. It's not next 2 or 3 years, next 25, 30 years, how you get to that net zero in whichever year the government decides it's going to be in a few years' time.
So have you, in terms of, you talk about some of these competing issues and risks, and so what have North Star in particular done to sort of make themselves, ensure themselves that they fit for purpose in terms of, from a structural perspective, for example, for the future? Have you been working on that in terms of ensuring that you're, for example, as streamlined as possible in terms of a governance perspective in dealing with some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I joined North Star in 2019, and it's very, very clear in the interview that part of one of my projects when I got my feet under the desk was around collapsing a group structure and refinancing. So we're really an organisation just under 4,000 units. We had quite a complicated governance structure. So we had four members of the group, a non-charitable parent company. We had far too many funding agreements in place with different funders, different covenants, and just added a bit of complexity to both the governance and the funding. So during 2020, we embarked upon a refinancing project to collapse the group structure and look at putting new funding in place. The timing wasn't great, so we kicked the project off in February 2020, and then obviously you run straight into lockdown, and all that that became an initial distraction, I suppose, for the management team to keep the business going during that first challenging lockdown. I think we're all now used to what that means, but there was that real uncertainty at the time around how we'd manage a really big corporate project at the same time as some real business as usual type issues. We ran that project during sort of the summer of last year, completed in November, collapsed the group structure, put new funding in place, went through a credit rating, investor roadshow, all the things that would normally have happened, but all happened virtually. And so that was great in some ways. It did bring some new challenge to it when you've got to make sure the technology works. And we also had the added challenge, certainly from a timing perspective, we sort of started to run into the US elections. So suddenly looking after the finance of 4,000 units in the northeast of England, I had one eye on the timing of the US elections because that would affect the markets. So that was a new dimension to risk management when you start worrying who's going to win the US elections might affect your ability to price a transaction in the UK.
Yeah.
But we got across the line, and one of the key drivers of that was simplicity. So simpler funding, simpler governance structures, and that's really been a huge benefit in the last 12 months around the business plan, the budget, the regulatory returns, all much simpler, all much easier certainly for the staff, and I think easier for the board to comprehend and ask us the right sort of questions. So just a much simpler organisation now, one organisation, a couple of funding arrangements, and long-term fixed rate debt. So it gives us that sort of resilience that we need in sort of these challenging times.
Excellent. It's good to hear that. Obviously a lot of work's gone in the last couple of years in terms of getting that structure right. I suppose one of the interesting dynamics at the moment, and we're filming this before Christmas, and actually the inflation rates come out today at over 5%, and I suppose there's a little bit of a challenge, a significant challenge for organisations themselves around that. There's challenges potentially around supply chain, and actually some of that you see some of that being driven by, I suppose, there's an issue around materials and lack of materials and potentially causing issues around. But there's also then that impact on potential impact on tenants if inflation remains high, and actually the last couple of months it has been, and then the rent increase potentially could be something that's significant. And I know some organisations had a bit of a discussion around that rent increase. So I'd just be interested in your take around some of those more financial pressures, and how North Star are approaching those.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of fairly hot off the press. We had our board meeting earlier this week, and there was a very detailed discussion around the rent increase. We gave a pretty comprehensive paper that obviously looked at the financial impact for North Star. What does not applying the rent increase mean? What's the impact of 1%? How that compounds up over 30 years? What our drivers are around that? What we'll use that money for? But equally, there was lots of information about the affordability for our customers. So using some of the metrics around 35% of net average earnings, looking at that data in some fairly granular detail, and also looking at what might be happening to customer finances into next year. There's quite a few things changing, whether it's living wage, obviously universal credit changes, and trying to weigh up all of that to reach a decision on what the rent increase should be. We're clear that I think the rent increase is a key for the sector to enable us to make the investments, both in new homes, existing homes, and with the upcoming pressures. So whether that's health and safety compliance or retrofit, or even just inflationary pressures. Like you said, September CPI was 3.1, it's now over 5.1. Inflation within the rebuild cost is running far higher than that. That's starting to flow back through certainly the contractors and supply chain around those discussions around where prices might land next year, and certainly that'll be significantly in excess of probably a rent increase even with the CPI +1. So trying to balance all those competing pressures off, it's a real challenge because there's no right, it's right and right, both answers are right. One's right for the organisation, it's trying to then how you manage the impact for our customers and support them. So we have small patch sizes in this organisation, really close relationship with customers that served us well during COVID. But that will mean there will be challenges, but we're hopefully in a really good position to be able to react to that. We'll put aside some of that rent increase specifically to help customers and communities next year. And we're hopeful that we have the organisational knowledge and expertise in our staff team to make sure we have the right support in the right place for people during next year, whether that's from April or later in the year as things evolve, because obviously we're on the brink of Omicron, and whether that means another lockdown, what that might mean into the new year around how that might affect the economy, and certainly tenants as well will be affected by that as that comes the fore in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, no, yeah, it is a challenging time. And actually, you talked about just on the theme of tenants, and so what's been interesting in the last couple of weeks is that there's been more coming out from the regulator around the potential sort of standards that they will be looking at from a regulatory perspective around consumer standards in particular. So I was just, and I suppose that's going to be additional burden for landlords, social landlords, to meet some of those potential requirements. I think there's out for consultation moments. What do you see? So how do you see the direction of travel moving around now? And what do you see some of the challenges for your types of organisations in dealing with those issues?
I mean, part of it is probably around transparency is one element of those new standards that we're working with really closely at the moment with a group of tenants. So our tenant scrutiny panel have done some work over the last few months around transparency, what that might mean for them, and how we might want to apply that within North Star. So they took that to our board earlier this month and had a really good conversation with no staff, just the customers and the board, talking around what transparency means to them. So I think everyone in the sector knows we have a load of information and data that we could quite happily share or publish, but it's sort of meaningless unless there's any context to it. So we're really trying to work out what do customers want to know about the organisation, what would help them understand the challenges, the dynamics of an organisation, and bring it to life a bit. So we're starting on that journey now. I think the other parts are satisfaction measures. Again, we've moved our satisfaction measures from probably the traditional, a couple of years ago, quite traditional telephone surveys, sort of in arrears, as it were, to live customer feedback using a platform that allows us to see instantly if there's customer dissatisfaction or a potential issue, that we can contact them straight away. So trying to be a bit more, use some of the technology to be a bit more reactive, move away from that. So it'd be interesting how these new standards sort of get brought to life by people in the sector. So I think there is a recognition around we need to get better at capturing, understanding, and responding to that feedback. And I think that the regulation gives a bit of structure to that, but we need to make sure we bring it to life for organisations and use it in the right way.
Yeah, no, I quite agree. I think there's also a significant piece in there, I think, about understanding your tenants, and that piece and this links back to the whole piece around data, which is a challenge, isn't it, for all organisations, and having accurate data. But have you so from your perspective, not just from a tenancy perspective, from a wider perspective, what sort of work have you done around that, ensuring that you get the data right?
I mean, it's key. I think it's probably this time last year when the sector risk profile came out, we recognised obviously where data lay on the RSH's agenda, and we've created a specific risk around data quality and how we manage that within the organisation. And we started a project in the summer to review and understand and sort of triangulate our data. So that's all our performance data initially. I've been working on that over the last couple of months across the organisation to identify how many bits of data there are performance-wise, and there are far more than you think you'd realise. And there's lots of nuances about how they get reported to different audiences, whether it's the customers, the board, the regulator, Housemarque. There's all these different outputs for information. We're making sure we really understand how that works and what the data flow is, and trying to minimise the handling of that data, where it historically has probably gone to Excel spreadsheet and had to have a bit of tidying up or adjustment to make sure it's in a consistent format. So doing loads of work around that, with the intention of implementing some new Power BI reporting in the new year, and that will be feeding right up to our board reports. So it's a really key bit of work, and we recognise how important it is. But obviously, in some areas, it's just absolutely critical. So things like your health and safety compliance, but all the way through to that sort of golden thread of information. A board member looking at arrears should have the same source of information as the housing officer. And if the tenant wants to know, that just golden thread throughout the business is really important, that we all understand that, and how each piece of information is presented to the relevant audience there. So a tenant's view on arrears might be different to a housing officer, to a finance person, through to the board member. So really sort of starting to get to grips with that and understand that. But it is a huge topic, and it will become increasingly important for the sector, because we do handle a huge amount of data and create a lot of data.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think that the focus will remain on that even more as we move forward. So just thinking about some of the other potential issues that may face an organisation such as yourselves, have you done, in terms of, for example, there's been a lot of talk recently around cyber, for example, and cyber risks in particular, and organisations inside and outside the sector, having ransomware issues and things. So, is that an area of particular focus for you as well?
Yep, it's a huge focus. I mean, I look after. We've now changed to a data and digital team from an ICT team. It's discussed pretty much every board meeting around cyber risk. There's always, I think, stories from the sector, from board members who've been involved or read about it or heard about it, or either within the sector around an incident or an issue somewhere. At our last board meeting, we had a deep dive on our cyber risk, and that allowed the board members to have a look at some of the tools. So things like the National Cybersecurity Centre board member toolkit, to go away and read that and come back with some questions for myself and the head of ICT or head of data and digital. And that allowed them to just get a better understanding, I think, because it is a really complicated area. There's a lot of technical terms, but we gave it a chance to sort of bring it to life and hopefully get all board members to a pretty common, at least base understanding of what we were doing about and what else we could do. We work really closely with our infrastructure providers. And the bit we always trying to focus on is what we do with our staff as well. Everything you read, every time I've been on a webinar or a briefing, it's about managing the risk of the staff member clicking on the wrong link or taking a bad decision on an email. So how we educate and keep it on the front of our staff's radar at all times. We do phishing campaigns every month. We did staff training for all staff back at the start of the year. We're doing revising that training and issuing it in the new year. So everyone will come in for at least an hour session where we chat around and show them examples of what a phishing email looks like, what happens when you click on one, what the consequences are. And it's really interesting doing it earlier this year, because I think what it brought home to staff is, there's a risk within North Star, but it's the personal risk.
Yeah.
As someone who, everyone does online shopping, has multiple online accounts, the risk you're putting yourself through if you have the same password on those accounts. And we shared some tools people can use to check that, looked at using the 3 random words and just give people some information. Because I think there's an assumption there's nothing you do about it. Actually, there's loads you can do as an individual, both as an employee, but also as an individual, around how you manage your cyber risk. And I think that'll become even more important next year. Like I said, each time I speak to people in the sector, there's another housing association had an issue, had a problem, had a challenge with it. I'm just obviously hoping you have the right plans in place if you do have an issue, but have the right defences to hopefully minimise the chance of you having that issue in the first place.
I think you're quite correct. I think it's an incredibly fluid and challenging environment around cyber, and we're finding that with our clients. And actually, on the Social Housing Barometer, it's something that's continuing over year being quite high up in terms of is something that could impact on organisations. I suppose one of what's interesting about your organisation, actually, I mean, just even the last couple of weeks, you've been very successful in terms of winning. I think you won Investors and People Award. Was it platinum one?
Well, we retained our platinum accreditation. We were the first in the sector to get that 3 years ago, and we did our re-accreditation at the end of 2020, so the end of the pandemic summer. And there was a bit of nervousness, I think, from the senior team around, well, where was staff at, having been working from home, and suddenly that agile ways of working, new technology. And so we're really proud to retain it last sort of August, September time. That was great. But then we got shortlisted by the IIP for, I think it was sort of the small organisation, we 50 and 250 units for the Platinum Award, and we won that about 3 weeks ago. And you're up against some fantastic other organisations. That was a sort of really proud moment for the organisation, because we're proud of the Platinum, but this is sort of the best of the Platinum, and that's something we're really proud of. And I think it reflects on everyone in the organisation around the hard work we did before I joined, but how we've carried that on during. It has been a tough 2 years with the lockdown, and this is how we've worked with our staff and supported them. So it was really nice, that recognition. So it's been a strange time. It's successful. We had to say we ran into, probably in the last 2 or 3 months, 3 or 4 different awards for different parts of the business around some of the stuff we've done around EDI, Employer of the Year, the CIH, all these different things. And when we don't necessarily target them, they're just nice when they happen. And it's just nice to get that recognition sometimes. You get your head down, and everyone has been working hard the last 18 months. Has been a challenging time for lots of different reasons. So it's nice to have a bit of that recognition, a chance for staff to celebrate and get that external recognition for some of the great stuff we've done.
And for you, that's sort of, it's not necessarily the recognition behind it, which is always nice, but the fact that you do have those processes, procedures, policies in place to ensure that people are, from a wider perspective, from a work perspective, from a well-being perspective. Clearly, you're an organisation that really looks after people. But do you think with the increasing pressures of talk about some of the financial pressures going to the future, some billions of pounds in terms of environmental from a sector perspective, I know the other pressures in terms of from a financial perspective as well. Do you think there's a risk that some of those things might fall away a little bit for the sector? And do you think, and we're also, I suppose, a little bit to that question is, for example, the ESG agenda is not just a social housing agenda; it's a whole and some organs in the private sector are really working hard on these, and always social housing has always been able to sort of distinct, it's a great place to work, it's different to commercial. Do you think there's a risk around that as well in terms of competitive edge in terms of people wanting to work for you?
Yeah, well, I think it's just a challenge. The current employment market is challenging at the moment. The idea you no longer have to work within commuting distance of where you live. There is that flexibility to say, I'll take a job that's 100 miles away and I'll come in the office a couple of days a month. That I think a couple of years ago, some people might have done it, but it was actually the exception rather than the rule. And people are now much more open to the idea of working remotely for a week at a time, or coming in for 1 day a week and managing their time in that way. So it is a challenge. It is about what you can offer staff, how you can support staff, and what the environment you create for them. I think a lot for me, again, getting back in the office, having that contact, that engagement is really important within North Star. So our staff all told us, a year and a bit ago, that they really valued being in the office together. They really valued working together, those connections they had, those relationships. And so we set up some guiding principles around coming in at least 2 days a week, and we've been working to those for a year now. We've reviewed them a couple of times. We're reviewing them again in the new year because it's such an evolving arrangement. It's brand new for everyone. So it feels like we've been doing it for ages, but we've only been doing this agile sort of working for probably a year and a half. And actually, we all need to learn what effect that has both on your home life and your work life, and try and get that balance right. I think it's quite easy to say, and I think it's people not just in our sector and others have shut down offices or said, right, this is the way we're going now. We're so early in working on what this actually means for people, for relationships, for creativity, for efficiency, that I think we just don't want to rush to that decision. We want to just make sure we work with our staff, as we have done, into next year and year after, around what does this actually mean? How do we want to work? What's it mean for our relationship with our customers? How do we keep that if we're working remotely? It's all great, we can do virtual viewings and some of that virtualization of the process, but actually relationships are really important, whether that's with our customers or amongst ourselves. So it's how we protect that with these new ways of working. The technology is great, but it should just be a part of it, not all of it. And I think we're really wrestling with that as an organisation and trying to understand how we need to operate as a business into the future.
Brilliant. Okay. Yeah, no, I think, and it goes back if you talked about some of these awards you've won and that's clearly a cultural piece, and the challenge around culture when people are not necessarily working in an office is difficult to manage. It's clearly something that, and it's interesting to hear what you're saying, because you're right, there are organisations out there who for their own reasons, which is clearly from their perspective is the right thing to do, have moved into that position of effectively having hubs and not really having an office, and the expectation that you work in the hub and then you come in the office very, very rarely. But from your perspective, that's something, clearly what you're still looking at in terms of what's the best way of doing this.
Yeah, and it'll evolve. And I think, again, speaking to our staff, if they're working from home, guidance at the moment, when we emailed staff, it's now an option whether you want to come in or not. Some staff were really grateful we kept the office open. For some people, it is a place they enjoy it. They like to come, whatever their home circumstances are, whatever they want, they get from work. They want to be in that environment. As long as that's a safe working environment, we should encourage that. So it's one of the things we did again during last year. We joined the Institute of Customer Service, and part of the conversation we had with them was around the organisations who had a really strong culture, really weathered the COVID storm well. Those who weren't quite there, they were the ones who found it a bit harder. So again, I think it was again well before my time. What I built up in a number of years with North Star gave us a really good starting position when the lockdown hit, and allowed us to maintain strong. I think it's now just sort of recalibrating where we're all at now and working out, well, what does the new look like now? What's going to happen regardless of the Omicron? What's that new working life look like? How do we support staff? How do we maintain those relationships? Will be really important, certainly for next year and moving forwards.
Cool. Okay. just conscious of time as well in terms of
Yep.
today. But I suppose one thing I would like to ask, it was interesting in the survey, there was a question primarily directed for board members around, mainly to do around the risk appetite and what their view on risk appetite had been in the previous 12 months.
Yeah.
And only 22% of organisations effectively said that their risk appetite had increased. So from a North Star perspective, what's your sense of that?
I think from when we did a session with our board earlier this year to sort of review and refresh our risk appetite, and that I'm trying to think that was probably March, April time, so just after the second lockdown. I suppose there was a bit of light at the end of the tunnel around COVID. So I think we've seen in some ways it's interesting that I think what everyone thought would happen during 2020 with COVID didn't necessarily manifest itself within the sector particularly. So I mean, the global accounts came out yesterday, and actually the sector fared remarkably well. I think that's positive around the sector. I think it might prove some challenges when people compare us to other sectors, but I think that's a great feather in the cap, I think, for a sector to react to that challenge really well, given how we have to work and the interaction we have with our customers to get through that really tough time and support our customers the way we did. I think it reflects really well around how people are prepared and the way people react really quickly to that. I think for board perspective, they didn't reflect too much. I think our big challenge, I think, from a risk appetite will be our desire to develop and balance that with the increasing cost of development.
Yeah.
So how do you square that circle? I think we're really keen. We know there's everyone knows there's a huge need out there for us to develop. We build general leads only, so affordable rent. So we're really targeting the communities we work in around supporting them. But I think for us, and certainly in the coming months, we'll be taking information back to board around, well, what's the parameters look like if our build costs increase by this much? What's the appetite within board to still build at that net build cost, and how that feeds through? And obviously, I know lots of organisations have the same conversation with Homes England about grant levels. Is this in hyperinflation? Where the support might come from that? What happened with the supply as that all sort of plays out during next year? I know inflation's high now, but I think that will definitely continue into next year, and that will put some real pressure on a really key area of everyone's business, which is building new units to drive efficiency. It's obviously key to any funding you have in place. Liquidity is such a key part. I think lots of organisations, RPs, the ability to build, meet that supply, and that's a really key thing around us being able to demonstrate a track record of delivery when the rent settlement agreement ends, and all the other things actually we have delivered in some really challenging times and continue to deliver. And that's really important. I think we can do that as a sector when the time is right, and that's obviously for the NHF and everyone else to make that case. But I think we all need to try and work on how you get that, because it will become increasingly challenging, I think. And again, we're just looking at some modelling we'll take to our board in January around how that might play through around average build costs and where it might go in the next 2 or 3 years, which is really difficult because it's the level of inflation we're seeing now has certainly not been seen in my lifetime, I don't think, around how aggressive it is and how that might play through on build costs. So it will be a challenge, certainly from a finance perspective.
No, I think you're quite right. I think the financial piece is challenging, and it'd be interesting to see how that flows through in terms of board's attitude to risk.
Yeah.
I think you're quite right. And the sector has done amazingly well compared to other sectors in terms of its robustness from COVID, both from not just from a financial perspective, which obviously came through in the global account survey, but also from a service perspective. It doesn't appear to be a significant dip in terms of service standards based on what I've seen anyway. So, but yeah, you're right. It's going to be challenging moving forward, seeing what happens, and especially around some of these inflationary pressures, and we'll see what comes of that.
Yeah.
I think actually, James, I think that's probably all we've got time for today. I think it's been really useful talking to you and understanding your take on some of the key issues coming through on the Social Housing Barometer this year, and actually how North Star faced them. And clearly, what you can see is North Star is a very resilient organisation, and actually, in some of this stuff around the tenant piece and the staff piece is actually right up there based on some of these awards that you received recently. So that's really, really good. So I just want to thank you for your time today. Yeah, I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ahmed.